Podcasting from Dallas, Texas, I am Shireen, and this is the Yumlish podcast. Yumlish is working to empower you to take charge of your health through diet and exercise and reduce the risk of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. We hope to share a unique perspective and a culturally relevant approach to managing these chronic conditions with you each week. Dr. Hirsch received his medical degree from the University of Missouri School of Medicine in 1984. From both a research and teaching point of view, Dr. Hirsch's career has focused on studying the best strategies for the use of insulin therapy in both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Welcome, Dr. Hirsch.
Thank you for having me.
An absolute pleasure. So, Dr. Hirsch, diving right in, help us understand a little bit more about your background and why exactly did you go into the space? What was it about diabetes?
Well, there's many different layers to answer that question, but I realized even as a medical student, um, we did not do as well as I felt the research had us at the time. I myself had diabetes since I was 6, my brother since he was 15, and my nephew since he was 3. Between the three of us, there's over a century of diabetes. And I felt that from both a practical point of view and then as I got more into the research setting, that we could do something to improve the lives of people, especially with insulin, but later technology. And I should point out the other drugs for treating type 2 diabetes has also become a real interest of mine. Drugs that not only treat the glucose, but also treat the cardiovascular and the renal complications. So, from a lot of different perspectives, I have found this to be fascinating. And I think it's because we started from such humble beginnings.
I do want to take a minute and let our audience know here that we're recording this interview on August 8th. First, let's just start out with everything that's been going on in the news recently, Dr. Hirsch. So, let's start with what are some of the reasons you believe insulin access has gotten political? And then I want to drive to a historic landmark that did or actually did not happen this weekend. So, we'll come to that in just a second. But first, help us understand just the political landscape that is insulin access right now.
One could actually consider insulin access and the fact that it's become political. It's really been like that for the last 101 years. The fact that the patent for insulin was sold from the University of Toronto to the manufacturers of insulin, initially here in the United States at Eli Lilly for $1. The spirit of that was that insulin would be accessible for everybody. But obviously, that's not what happened in the 1920s and 1930s and still today. In fact, until very recently, in the low and mid income countries, um, having a child with type 1 diabetes was essentially a death sentence. And until very recently, um, those children typically did not survive for a year. But in the high income countries like the United States, um, the fact that our system here, and we're going to focus just on the US for a moment because each country does this differently. But if we just focus on the US, uh, we don't have a national healthcare system. People can charge what they want to for the insulin. And our healthcare system is so difficult because there are so many different components to it. And in 20 to 22 minutes, we don't have enough time to really talk about how complicated it is. But if you get your insulin from the VA system or from Medicare or a Medicaid state or a regular third party commercial payer, you're going to pay different amounts of money for that. And it became political, really became super political within the last, I would say, 15 to 20 years when the prices of the insulin got to be so high. That is the retail price. But not everybody paid the retail price, and it depended on what one's insurance was. And eventually it got to the point that people started rationing their insulin. And even before that, people would complain to their senators and their congressmen and their congresswomen and then their state representatives. But there was very little they could do because the system had become so dysfunctional. And people ended up having to pay full price for the insulin, which is enormous. In fact, right now, it is enormous if you're paying retail. But the politicians were brought in because there were all of these people making so much money on these families who were just trying to keep their families and especially their children alive. And it wasn't supposed to be that way when the patent for insulin was sold for $1. But at the end of the day, there's a very complex system where we have the drug manufacturer, we have these middlemen are the pharmacy benefit managers and the pharmacies, and we have the payer, and we have the patient. And as it turns out, these middlemen and middlewomen, the pharmacy benefit managers, they're the ones that are making all of the money. At least they are the ones who've had the greatest increase in their money in the past 5 to 10 years. And what's been amazing about this story is that the pharmaceutical companies, they're still making money, but their profits have actually gone down. Their profits have gone down. It's these middlemen that have not been touched. And the politicians have not done enough, in most of our views, to these middlemen, these pharmacy benefit managers. And they're the ones who really set the price for the patients. And it's very complicated, but it needs to be pointed out that the big other part of this, we have the drug manufacturers, we have the middlemen and middlewomen, but then we also have the politicians. And the politicians are really important. As you noted, today is August 8th, 2022, because as it turns out, the politicians get lobbying money. And it's not very transparent where all the lobbying money comes from. But what we do know from this one source called um, the website is, I want to make sure I say it right, and I can't remember it now. I can't remember this important website, but you can see who's getting money from who. And what I can tell you is that for the three main pharmaceutical companies, and this is not just relegated to insulin, but they are in the top 25 companies that use lobbying money um, to the senators and the congressmen and the congresswomen. And I have a problem with this at many levels because I don't quite understand what lobbying money does other than to use the word bribery. And the reason why that became so important yesterday, which was August 7th, is that in part of this very large healthcare benefits bill that was first proposed by the president and was passed by Congress, when it got to the Senate yesterday, there was a ruling so that they needed to have 10 senators pass this for this to happen for the non-Medicare patients, and it didn't happen, which means um, there won't be any cap on insulin prices for most of the country, the millions of people who take insulin, who are uh, insured by the third party payers. The other really important group of people to think about, and and it's too soon to know what's going to happen with this group, are those individuals who get Medicaid. And just as a reminder, Medicaid are those parts of our population that generally are lower income, often minorities. And what the Affordable Care Act did is that it allowed states to have the option of Medicaid expansion. And that was wonderful because with Medicaid expansion, and I live in one of those Medicaid expansion states here in the state of Washington, we can ensure that our underserved population has access to insulin and other medical needs. For example, here in Washington state, our patients with diabetes, if they qualify and they take insulin, also have access to continuous glucose monitoring. And so that's great, but that's if you live in Washington state, because as it turns out, there are 12 states that do not have Medicaid expansion. And these states are mostly in the southeast part of the US, including the state of Texas. And in those states, without Medicaid expansion, these people who are underserved and who don't have a lot of expendable income, they also can't afford their insulin when a vial of insulin can be $200 or $300 a vial. Now, to be fair, the insulin companies are now trying to help this population, and that's a good thing. But nevertheless, they have to struggle and they have to know how to navigate the system. And everything that happened in the Senate over the weekend, here on August 8th, I don't know how that's going to affect the Medicaid group. In fact, I have a call later this afternoon to talk to some of the lawmakers to see if they know, because this is all happening so fast and furiously. It's a moving target. But this is what I do know. What I do know is when insulin was discovered, it was thought to be this is something that was thought to be a right and not a privilege. And when you go to most countries of the world today in 2022, that's exactly what it is. It may not be the best insulin, it may not be the newest insulin, but insulin is available for almost everybody in the world. But that's not true if you live in the United States. We have the same amount of insulin rationing here in this country as the low and mid income countries do around the world. That shouldn't be either. Now, I think it shouldn't be where you live in the United States is also going to dictate if you have access to insulin. But that's also true because the decision was that every state would have the opportunity to decide if they were going to have Medicaid expansion. And if it didn't have Medicaid expansion, you may not have access to insulin in addition to um, other drugs. And so I'm sort of rambling here, and I apologize to this, but it is really a fascinating and heartbreaking topic when I see patient after patient where they can't afford their meds and they can't afford their insulin. And the other final point in this bit of a ramble that I'm doing, and I apologize for that, is that I talked to a patient this morning. I saw patients today. It's August 8th and it's a Monday. And I saw a patient this morning who had just spent some time in Southern California. And what she and her family did was they went across the border and they got all of this insulin in Mexico. In Mexico. Because the other interesting part is that as difficult as it is for some people to pay for insulin, if you are going to use an analog insulin like Lantus or Novolog or Humalog, you need a prescription. Whereas in most countries of the world, you don't need a prescription. So besides the cost, we have this prescription deal, which makes it even more difficult for people to have access. So one of the things that I've learned is that not everybody can navigate the system. And part of that has to do, I think, with um, their socioeconomic background. And we shouldn't make it this hard, but that's what we've done. And I'm just afraid that with what happened over the weekend, and I hope I'm wrong about this because it just happened yesterday, but I'm afraid we're going to be making it worse instead of better.
I do want to dive into that a little bit more, Dr. Hirsch. So help us understand what exactly was in the bill this weekend. Why is it a big deal to anyone out there listening who depends on insulin? So can you help us understand first what was on the bill, what happened to it at the nth hour, and how does it impact a listener who's again dependent on insulin?
So My understanding is that if you are a Medicare patient, what is going to happen is you are going to have very easy access to insulin. I don't know what it's going to look like at the end. I don't even know when this is going to happen. Um, but when it does happen, what the plan was for a $35 cap per month for insulin. And I think we will see something like that or even better for our seniors. And I should point out that the over 65-year-old age group on insulin continues to grow in the United States. And where it is especially growing is in people with type 1 diabetes who need insulin for survival. A patient with type 2 diabetes who doesn't take insulin, they aren't going to die. They're just going to have high blood sugars. But somebody with type 1, they need it for survival. So the good part is our seniors are going to have access to insulin at a reasonable cost. The problem is the non-Medicare patients, the under 65-year-olds. Um, it's going to be business as usual, meaning how much you pay for your insulin will be based on your insurance. But it again gets back to the point, it also depends on what state you live in, because certain states have already put in caps for insulin. Colorado, for example, was one of the first. We are doing that here in Washington state. So in our states, I think what's going to happen over time is that there will be cheaper insulin. I can tell you, I work for a state institution, so we already have this cap on value. It's called value formulary for insulin. Not everybody who works in Washington state has that, but the hope is that will happen someday. That's my hope, especially since the feds let us down. And I do mean that. The feds let us down. So now it has to come up to the states to help people with affordable insulin. No, no parent should have to worry about, do we put food on the table or do we get insulin for, whether it's for dad or for the child. But that's what we've decided to do in this country. At least that was what was decided to do in the U.S. Senate yesterday. And the reason why that was decided was they could not find 10 senators to vote, 10 Republican senators to vote for this. They only had 7. And so the bill failed.
And so, if it had gone through that $35 cap that you're talking about, regardless of state, it doesn't matter what the state rules are, that $35 cap would have applied nationally across all these states. But what happened is at the last hour, because enough votes didn't come in from the Republican side, they had to nix that piece off the bill and get the rest of it passed, or however they went about editing it. But the point being, they could not get that $35 cap for insulin passed yesterday.
That's exactly what happened. And in fact, this morning I saw 9 patients. 8 of the 9 asked pretty much the same question. What, why would they do that to us? Why would they make this so difficult for us? And it's a fair question, and I'd like to know that answer too. It would be interesting to talk to them. Why did you do this?
That's incredibly unfortunate. Dr. Hirsch, I want to talk about what does that mean? So what does it mean from someone from low income communities that does not have a state that is in a state that does not have expanded Medicaid access in their state? What does it mean to not have access to that insulin?
Well, it means there has to be workarounds. Now, here's the good news. There are workarounds. You can find it online what these workarounds are, but it gets back to the same thing. You have to know how to find the workarounds. You have to know how to access the system. You have to be sophisticated with the system. And just a lot of people in those communities are not. And that is part of the problem. So here's the good news. The good news is one can pick up very inexpensive human insulin. I remember when human insulin was introduced in the United States in 1982. Um, not as it, it is probably not what you would want to do with all the wonderful developments that have happened with insulin, but we got by just fine uh, before we had the fancy insulin analogs, which started in 1996. We did fine with that. You can get this insulin very cheap. Walmart, for example, they make it in their own brand called Rely On. It comes from Novo Nordisk, at least it did. $25 for a vial of insulin. You can get it very inexpensive at Walmart. Um, and we do that. We do that with a lot of our patients. Um, the companies now, all three of them have wonderful um, programs for people who cannot afford their insulin. The problem is you have to know how to access these programs online. But the programs are there. And I can tell you they are not advertised. The pharmacies, at least that I know of here where I live, the pharmacies don't talk about these programs. At least I haven't seen it. But these programs are out there and they're actually very, very good. All three of them have it. Not as cheap as the human insulin, but much more expensive than getting it retail. That's number two. Number three, and I can tell you here where I live, about 2 hours from the Canadian border, um, both from Canada and Mexico, you don't need a prescription to get insulin. And you can get the uh, insulin analogs much cheaper than you can here in the US, a fraction of the cost. So that's number three. There's one other situation that does not get enough publicity. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this before. Have you ever heard of the federally funded 340B program? So 340B is something that is not very well appreciated, and they are especially true in inner city hospitals where there are a lot of um, underserved people, where the hospital is able to apply to the federal government to get this designation where they can sell insulin for pennies, very, very cheap. Um, to For a patient, or for that matter, for a physician who is wondering, it's not talked about much, but the insulin is very cheap. And as a 340B hospital, or as a patient, if you want to get your insulin from a 340B hospital, the physician has to be part of that hospital system. So um, we are part of a 340B system, so we sell insulin very cheap. I don't know what it is right now, but I remember when this was very popular 5, 6 years ago. We would have patients come to the University of Washington to see a doctor just once so they could get the insulin very cheaply from us. But it's something that needs to get much more attention than it has.
340B. We'll make sure to put a link on that in our show notes. Dr. Hirsch, can you help us understand what are the consequences? And we hear this all the time of people rationing their insulin. Can you help us understand what the consequences
Sure,
of doing that?
sure. Well, for everybody who rations insulin, their blood sugars are going to be higher. And from a long-term point of view, we've known now for decades that increases your risk of kidney disease, lower extremity amputation, blindness. It's very scary. The bigger issue, however, is acutely. For somebody with type 1 diabetes who doesn't make insulin, they're not going to last very long um, without ending up very sick. Before the discovery of insulin, this is how people died with ketoacidosis. That's the name of the condition, diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA. And we know to this day the most common reason, especially in inner city hospitals, for DKA is lack of access to insulin. I also should point out I was volunteering. I'm not going to tell you what state it was. It was not where I am now. I was volunteering in a medical student diabetes clinic, specifically for the underserved community in this city, in this state. And this was probably about 5 years ago. And a young woman came in, 28 years old. Um, the reason why she came in was for free insulin samples. She had no insulin at all. And the question is, in this state, would Medicaid pay for the insulin? Well, they had a rule that the only way Medicaid would then cover your insulin was if you ended up in the hospital with ketoacidosis or in the hospital for another reason, then the state would pay for your insulin. Otherwise, you were on your own. And so what I learned in this clinic where I was volunteering is that night after night during this clinic, they had to make a decision. Were they going to send this patient to the hospital, admit this patient to the hospital so she could then get her insulin for the next year, for 1 year, or would they give her samples so she would just come back in a month or two to get more insulin, but she would be dependent on driving 5 hours to get this free insulin? Or should they put her in the hospital? I mean, this is how you have to play the system. It makes no sense.
Well, Dr. Hirsch, can you show us the light at the end of the tunnel? We're wrapping up toward the end of the episode here. Can you show us what is the light at the end of the tunnel here? What would you see sort of coming after this, after what you heard happen yesterday?
This is what I'm hoping. I mean, there are other political issues, and insulin is right up there. And, one of the good things is, in my view, what happened yesterday was so unexpected and so bad. It's This story is on the front page of every paper this morning, every paper in the country, that we are denying insulin to people. Um, that this is what happened in the Senate yesterday. And I'm hoping that this becomes a major political issue. And, as opposed to, I'm just going to pick this, as opposed to abortion, as an example, there isn't a religious or an ethical reason. Now, you may agree or disagree with the ethics and morality of abortion, but to me, the ethics and morality of having access to insulin, that's not in the same bucket. That's not in the same bucket. You can't compare the two because, again, it gets down, is insulin a right or is it a privilege? In my opinion, and for the Canadian scientists who discovered insulin, it is a right. It's not a privilege. But those senators yesterday did not get that memo. They did not get that memo. And so it is my hope that this gets enough political wins at its back that eventually this comes back to these same senators or maybe different senators because of the political backlash, since this is now a political issue, and this can be fixed.
Dr. Hirsch, with that, thank you so very much for your time. We try to squeeze as much as we can in
It's
these
a
short few
lot.
minutes, but it is a lot indeed. Thank you so very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You are very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Yumlish podcast. Make sure to follow us on social media at Yumlish underscore on Instagram and Twitter, and at Yumlish on Facebook and LinkedIn for tips about managing your diabetes and other chronic conditions, and to chat and connect with us about your journey and perspective. You can also visit our website, yumlish.com, for more recipes, advice, and to get involved with all of the exciting opportunities Yumlish has to offer. If you like this week's show, make sure to subscribe so you can hear more from us every time we post. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Remember, your health always comes first. Stay well.